Well, good morning. It's great to be with you. I'm going to try and produce a sermon from John chapter 18 as we've been working our way through John's Gospel. I hope you find it helpful as we can't meet at church at present. Let me begin first of all with the reading. When he finished praying, Jesus left his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Jesus, who had betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you, I am he," Jesus answered. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Well, it's a momentous time, and as we're leading up to Easter, it's a time we often remember. And it's a story of gardens in many, many ways. Poet Dorothy Gurney wrote, "You are nearer to God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth." And maybe that's a bit sentimental, but it's true that people often feel a sense of wonder, which points to something or someone beyond this world. It's often evoked by experiencing the beauty of nature. Charles Darwin in his early life visited the rainforest of Brazil, which filled him with feelings of awe, wonder, admiration and devotion. That was, of course, before he rejected his belief in God. Later, as he began to embrace the philosophy of naturalism, that's the idea that there is no God or a spiritual world, only that which can be seen, heard and touched, he admitted that he lost the ability to appreciate anything other than hard data. He said, "Now the grandest scenes would not cause any such convictions and feelings to rise in my mind. It may be truly said that I am like a man who has become colourblind." The same happened with poetry, drama, art and music, all of which he used to delight in. He confessed in his autobiography, "But now, for many years, I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I've tried recently to read Shakespeare and found it so intolerably dull that it nauseated me. I've also lost my taste for pictures or music. My mind has become a kind of machine for grinding laws out of a large collection of facts." Sadly, what we see here is a withering of Darwin's soul, so that he's became more like a machine really than a man. Now, I think it's interesting that in the Bible it's in two gardens which create those feelings of devotion spoken of by the early Darwin, that we see two spiritual battles for the soul of mankind taking place. In fact, you could say that the story of the Bible is a story of two gardens, the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. In the first, Adam took a fall. In the second, Jesus took a stand. In Eden, Satan led Adam to a tree that led to his death. In Gethsemane, Jesus went to a tree which led to our life. And in both cases, the stakes are extremely high, namely the soul of every man, woman, child living on this planet. You see, to disobey God means to come under the judgment of God and being banished from Eden. So like the fallen Adam, we find ourselves east of Eden, lost, wandering aimlessly through life, having a feeling that we're made for something more, but not being quite sure what that something is. As our senses become increasingly dulled, as Darwin found, even more than that, the eternal well-being of our soul is at stake. Consequently, we need someone who's able to undo and reverse the effects of the havoc Satan and sin introduced in that first garden. And it's that someone we see in the second garden, Gethsemane. And that's where we're going today as we turn to John 18 and consider the triumph of the Son. Now, in a sense, what Satan did in Eden, he still does today by destroying the sacred. So truth is replaced by lies, trust with suspicion, harmony with chaos. The boy isn't that's exactly what we see happening. Isn't that exactly what we see happening in the world around us? Jesus reclaims the holy. He won't sit back in silence as Satan steals the sacred. At the right moment, he stands and speaks, and Satan and his instruments stumble and are silenced. And that is exactly what we see taking place here. First of all, in verses 1 to 5, we see a divine presence. When he finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding the detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests, Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. That Satan is instrumental in these events is more than just lurking in the background, which has already been more than hinted at earlier in John's Gospel. So, for example, in John chapter 8, Jesus finds himself in conflict with the Jewish authorities because of his miracles and claims to divinity. And he says to them in verse 44, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire." And what was that? Well, Jesus goes on to tell them, he was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. Verse 37, he says, "You are ready to kill me because you have no room for my word." You see, when faced with God's truth incarnate in Jesus, the religious authorities plot to get rid of him, to murder their maker. And that's what they're about to do here. Just a few hours earlier, as Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Last Supper, we see Satan making his next move in chapter 13, verse 27, having said that one of his own followers would betray him. We then read, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Then verse 30, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out and it was night. Too true it was. Not only had a physical darkness descended, but so had a spiritual darkness. And the results of this satanic manoeuvring we see coming together in Gethsemane. The father of lies, who introduced death in the first garden using a serpent, is now seeking to bring about more death in the second garden using soldiers. Just read verse 3. What impression do you have? Is it one of Judas sneakily leading the way to Jesus' secret rendezvous, perhaps with a handful of soldiers or one or two of the Jewish officials in tow? That's often what I've thought, I think, until really looking at it in more depth. But when John speaks of a detachment of soldiers, the Greek word is spira, which has three possible meanings. It could refer to a Roman cohort of 300 men. It could also signify cavalry or infantry of nearly 2,000 men. Or it could mean a detachment known as a maniple, which contained 200 men. Amazing, isn't it, that at least we're talking of 200 armed men dispatched to arrest a carpenter and an assortment of tax collectors and fishermen. And as if that were not enough, you also have the officials of the chief priests and Pharisees. Lovely euphemism, that, officials. That's like referring to the Gestapo as state investigators. They were in fact the temple police, and they too would have been armed to the teeth. So these are Israel's finest as well as Rome's. And then of course there's Judas, one of Jesus' own inner circle. Hell must have been throwing a party that night. Satan must have thought that even he had surpassed himself here. The Roman government, the Jewish establishment, and even a member of Jesus' own cabinet all conspire to inflict the final death blow on the Son of God. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd have been terrified at that sight. To be praying safe and secure in the company of friends one minute, and then to be faced with a mob coming out of the darkness the next, is enough to freeze the blood in anybody's veins. Just imagine walking down the dark side streets of Barrow late on a Saturday night, and there blocking your way is a gang having had too much to drink, with knives flashing and broken beer bottles being brandished. How would you feel? You'd be terrified, of course. But verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Rather than retreat further into the garden as a coward, Jesus went to meet them as a conqueror. He knows what's going to happen. Here is a divine presence, one who is in complete control of things. And that is so clearly comes out in what happens next, when we see the divine declaration in verse 4. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. "And if you're looking for me, then let these men go." Now, isn't that remarkable? They only stand a few feet away from his face, and they don't recognise him. But as is often the case in John's Gospel, words and descriptions operate at two levels, the literal surface level and the deeper spiritual level. On the surface, they didn't know which of the crowd was Jesus of Nazareth, hence the question. But at a deeper spiritual level, they didn't realise that he was God incarnate. Hence the answer, "I am he." And at that moment, the first dominoes flicked, and down they all hit the floor. If the situation wasn't so serious, it'd be funny. These are the best Satan can come up with. Rome's finest, the temple's elite, and one word from Jesus and 200 fighting men collapse to the ground in a noisy, clanking pile of shields, swords and armour. So this is more like a scrapyard than a lynch mob. Now don't you miss the symbolism. When Jesus speaks, Satan falls. It doesn't matter if the evil one's recruited. It doesn't matter if he's infiltrated the government. It doesn't matter if he's seduced God's temple. It doesn't even matter if he's enlisted one of the original handpicked apostles. The best of Satan melts like wax in the presence of Christ. But do you believe that? Why? What's so special about Jesus' reply? That this should be the response, a response which immediate and involuntary total collapse. Well, the Greek form of what Jesus says is literally, "I am." Jesus is using a divine declaration. This is the form of self-identification that God himself takes to his lips throughout the book of the prophet Isaiah. So, for example, in Isaiah 41 verse 4, "Who has called forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them and the last. I am he. Isaiah 43 verse 11. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant who I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Or Isaiah 51 verse 12. I, even I am he who comforts you. And of course, there's the example from Exodus 3, when Moses fears the Israelites will not believe who has sent him. Who should have sent me? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you say to the Israelites. I am sent you. At one level, Jesus answers a question. The question is that, yes, he's the one that they're looking for. But at another level, he's revealing his true identity, that he's none other than God of the universe, in whose presence you fall down. This has always been the effect in the presence of the divine. It happened in Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 27 as the prophet saw a figure on a throne, which he describes as the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And what happened? Well, Ezekiel tells us that when he saw it, he fell face down as he heard the voice of one speaking. John, the writer of the Gospel, had a similar experience when in exile on Patmos in the book of Revelation. In chapter 1, verse 17, he says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. For one split second in that garden, as a result of the divine word spoken, the glory of the one and only God showed itself, and the effects were immediately felt, although not fully understood. These people wanted Jesus of Nazareth, and that's who they got. But of course, they got far more than they bargained for. They got their maker and their judge. And so it is today. People want Jesus of Nazareth. The searching's even given noble terms like spirituality. And like these people, they try to domesticate him somehow. They want a Jesus that they can handle, that they can shape into who they want him to be. People are happy to have a Jesus as a prophet. You can even have him as some inspiring religious leader. But be warned, when you approach the real Christ of the Bible, you'll discover that he far exceeds all those things. If we honestly turn to the Bible's account of him, you too will hear his voice speaking, and when you do, then you'll be brought to the ground spiritually. One person who discovered this in his own experience was C.S. Lewis. For years he was like a militant atheist, but it was when he started to seriously look at the claims of Christ, the one G.K. Chesterton described in his book as the everlasting man, that he realised how weak his atheism was and how strong was the alternative. But bow to the inevitable, he eventually did. This is how he describes it. He said, you must picture me alone in a room at Magdalen College, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God. I knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. You see, that was the night he met with divine royalty. No wonder, in his Narnia books, Lewis depicts Christ-like figure of Aslan as a lion, whose roar has the same effect as the voice of Christ in the garden. So in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, we have this little episode which echoes the event we're looking at near. And now, said Aslan presently, to business. I feel I am going to roar. You'd better put your fingers in your ears. And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare look at it. They saw all the trees in front of them bend before the blast of his roaring, as the grass bends in a meadow before the wind. Before the Lion of Judah, you bend. And why was Jesus so confident that he could face his accusers with a dignified calm? Because he knew this was all part of the divine purpose, verse 7. Again, he asked them, who is it you want? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. I told you that I am he, Jesus answered. And if you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Now we've seen that the Romans, the Jewish elite, and Judas are all willing conspirators of the great enemy of the soul. But there is one more Satan seeks to use in spite of all his good intentions, and that's Peter. You see it there in verse 11. Out comes the sword, and the all sorry episode could have ended there and then in the garden in a bloodbath if Jesus had not spoken and if the other disciples decided to follow suit. Let's face it, there had been no contest, 11 against 200. Who does Peter think he is, some sort of Zorro? Unless, of course, at the back of his mind was the thought that Jesus could somehow be forced into performing a miracle with a well-placed thunderbolt or two, and so usher in the kingdom of God by violent means. The devil would have loved that. Something similar had happened before, hadn't it? When Jesus first announced his mission to go to the cross. It was Peter who passionately tried to dissuade him, and so received that crushing rebuke from Jesus. Get behind me, Satan, for you are not on the side of God, but men. And so it is here. God's plan was within a hair's breadth of disaster, all because of one sincere but misguided apostle. But God's method of bringing in his kingdom was to be quite different. Not the way of the sword, but the way of sacrifice. It's not a matter of revolution, but of substitution. Let me explain what I mean. In verse 11, Jesus speaks of the necessity of drinking from the cup that the Father's given him. So what's the cup? Well, this is where the principle of using the Bible to interpret the Bible comes in. Psalm 75, verse 7, we read these words, it is God who judges. He brings one down and exalts another. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked drink it down to its very dregs. So this cup which Jesus is to drink is the cup of God's righteous anger or wrath towards wickedness and sin. Notice that this is what the Father wants the Son to do, and the Son wants to do it as well. He's speaking of the cross, that moment in time when the wickedness and sin of all time was placed upon the shoulders of the sinless one. And the fury of God's abhorrence to all that is unholy and filthy and ruinous is poured out on him, and he drinks that cup to the last drop on our behalf, in our place. Here is God's sacrifice for sin. Here is God's substitute for sinners. And the result of that wonderful work we see prefigured here in the garden in verse 8. I told you that I am he, Jesus answered. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. It's as Jesus is taken that his followers are released. He goes away to die so that they may live. Again, this is fulfilled on two levels, the literal and the spiritual. Literally, the disciples fled and were not captured, and Jesus was taken. But in a more profound sense, it's by Jesus dying the death we deserve that we are set free from sins, condemnation, and Satan's grip, and so ensuring eternally not one of those given to Jesus by his Father will be lost. In short, he's talking about Christians, those who have surrendered their lives to him. Now that's the divine purpose behind all these events, our salvation. Or Satan may think he's the master strategist, using the greedy, the abusive, and the weak-willed to further his ends. But even his designs are taken by God to serve his higher purpose, namely Satan's own defeat through the triumph of the Son. Whatever you do, don't miss the reassurance this passage provides. Satan falls in the presence of Christ. One word from his lips, and the finest army in the world collapses. Satan is powerless against the protection of Christ. I've not lost any of the ones you gave me. So when Jesus says he'll keep you safe, he means it. Isn't that reassuring? What we're going through right now? Isn't that what we need to hear? But isn't this what Jesus has proved again and again and again? Hell will have to get through him to get to you. And he's already been to hell for you. When he says he'll get you home to heaven, he will get you home. And the proof that he will? Well, that brings us to a third garden, in which we can see an empty tomb and a risen, conquering Saviour. To God be the glory, great things he has done. Let's pray. Loving Father God, we just thank you that Jesus, even at this hour of gloom and doom, in so many ways, is the conquering hero. Despite facing death, he points to life eternal. Although submitting to a cross, he's the risen conqueror. Although he makes himself weak, he is the all-sovereign, powerful God of the universe. So Lord, help us to trust him in our time of need, we pray. And we pray in the name of this conquering King Jesus. Amen.